Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Coffee Shop Philosophy. As always, I'm your host, Killian, managing editor for think-liberty.com and news editor for the Being Libertarian family of publications. As always, you can follow us on all social media feeds. You can listen to podcasts wherever you get your podcasts from throughout our network, and make sure to check out our websites on a daily basis for all of the new articles and content that comes out that way. For today's episode, what I wanted to talk about was Superlibertarians. Now, normally you'd hear the phrase Superlibertarians and you would think that that's a very, very positive statement, a very plus thing to say, but I'm not meaning it that way, not in the slightest. I'm talking about the people where you can't have a normal conversation without them trying to make it about their libertarianism. I'm talking about people where you could be discussing an issue at the level that an issue needs to be discussed, but they jump immediately to their deep-held principles and standards. Now, before I get into this, I need to clarify that principles are important. The entirety of the libertarian stance is based on the concept of principles. It's based on the idea that we are holding ourselves to a higher standard, but that doesn't mean that we need to shove it down everyone's throats. Sometimes it's okay to calm down a little bit on these things and maybe have the discussion at the level it needs to be had, or maybe even do the right thing and not interject your politics into other conversations for the sake of interjecting them. I'm going to give a couple of examples of what I mean, and hopefully you get an idea of the type of behavior that I'm talking about. And if you do identify yourself doing this, then hopefully you stop, because there's nothing that makes members of the liberty movement in general look worse than super libertarians. So I'll use a very basic example. Let's say, state level or province level or however your country is divided there. Let's say there's a discussion going on about how to best implement a new community outreach program. We'll use that as an example, a community outreach program. So there's a debate going on as to the best way to implement this community outreach program. Now, the super libertarian would jump in immediately and say, there shouldn't be anything implemented, government shouldn't do anything, taxation is theft, followed by some form of screeching. That's the part that we need to avoid. That's the thing that just drives me up the fucking wall when I see people do this. It boggles my mind how anyone can think that that's going to be productive to the conversation. Simply saying the government shouldn't do something doesn't necessarily change the fact that they're going to do it anyway. The decision has been made that they're going to do a thing. Now they're discussing how to do it. That doesn't mean that you need to shut off any opinions that you might have about how they can deal with that situation. You don't have to remove yourself from the conversation in order to stand up for the principles that you say you have. And I get it. You want to make it clear that that's the correct answer. The correct answer is the government not doing something. The correct answer is the government not stealing money from the pockets of people in order to enforce its own will. It doesn't add to the conversation, though. It doesn't change what's being discussed. In this situation, if they're talking about a, community outreach program, they've already allocated funds for it. They've already made the decision that they're going to be doing one. We're past bringing up the talking point that the government shouldn't be doing things. Now we have the opportunity to include an opinion on how they should do it in a way that's going to either be the least wasteful, the most impactful, or at least something productive out of it, rather than most forms of government expenditure, which is simply wasted money. Another great example of this would be the border debate. Now, I'm not talking about the libertarian open border, closed border debate or anything like that. I'm talking about the treatment of illegal immigrants and illegal border crossers. We can talk about whether borders should be open or closed or anything like that, and that's fine. But we can't just talk about that. And that's something that these super libertarians just do not comprehend. The borders exist as it stands. There is a force behind them. There is legal precedent for its existence. And we can yell and scream and say it's an imaginary line, it's an imaginary line. Well, it's an imaginary line with a bunch of guys with guns standing at the end of it saying, cross this line, I kill you. That's not that imaginary at that point. We have to deal with the reality that at present, there is a border. So while there is a border, how should it be managed? What type of actions are acceptable or unacceptable when it comes to people who try to violate this border and try to forcibly enter the country? Is it simply rush and arrest, deterrence? What systems are acceptable? How much should be invested into it? It's going to exist. There's going to be money spent on it. But the super libertarian type removes libertarianism from the conversation entirely because they immediately jump to their sound bites on the topic. This serves no one. It doesn't even serve the people who are trying to virtue signal their libertarianism in these discussions. If we're discussing what should be done with the border itself, then we need to have that conversation. We might view it as a D-class problem. As I mentioned on one of the previous episodes of Coffee Shop Philosophy, there's kind of a system for how you can classify what type of problem you're dealing with and whether there's higher grade issues that you can work off of that would, by effect, solve the later ones. But you still have to start in whatever class of problem you're starting in. We can't just jump to saying, oh, well, it should just be open borders anyway, so it really doesn't matter what's happening at the border. Yes, it does. There's a big difference between them using tear gas in order to deter people at the border versus just mowing them down, as some people have suggested, versus doing nothing and just letting everybody cross over. There's tons of things left to discuss in that space. And you might even have the opinion that, okay, I think it should be open borders, so there shouldn't be any kind of defense there, just let people come in. Well, that sounds great, but there's also the rest of the state that exists. We can talk about the, need for open borders if you're an open border libertarian, but that doesn't change that all of the other negative things in the United States or in your country, whichever country you're in, still exist. So simply pretending that the border isn't a thing and allowing complete unrestricted migration across it, you're going to run into some problems, especially if it's people that are coming from countries that had voted in people who enacted policies that damaged the country to the point where they are now fleeing it as political refugees. 1 + 1 = 2 sometimes. It's not hard math to figure out that while there's other components in play, jumping directly to open borders isn't the answer. But the super libertarian, he can't not say open borders. He has to declare his love for the concept of open borders in order to showcase how libertarian he is and how right libertarianism is, even though it contributes absolutely nothing to the conversation at hand and just really leads to the liberty movement itself being pushed aside when it comes to the sphere of political debate. Let's use another example here. You could be discussing, say, movies. I'll use movies as an example, something really simple. You could just be talking about movies. And if it's a movie where, let's say it's like a Die Hard movie or something like that, where the main character is a slightly renegade cop, all that generic 1980s action film style, lone wolf, police officer saves the world type people. Let's say it's one of those movies. And you could just be sitting there, watching it, trying to enjoy it. The super libertarian's the guy that's going to jump up throughout the movie talking about every time that he does something that a normal citizen wouldn't be allowed to get away with. Talks about the corruption in the police force and how that's how it is in real life. Guy can't shut up for more than 10 minutes before pointing out something else that's terrible about the police force because it's involved with the government. You're just trying to watch a movie. Okay, we get it. You vote gold. Good stuff, sport. Can we get back to watching the movie? I want to see Alan Rickman fall off the building already. Like, just stop. Just stop and let me enjoy the goddamn movie. I don't need to hear a diatribe about trade restrictions damaging localized economies when I put on Ghostbusters because there was an EPA issue. I don't need to hear it. I'm okay reading an article about that. I'm okay having that discussion if we're making a point of having that discussion and diving into that sort of thing. But if you're just jumping me with it, frankly, fuck off. Let's just enjoy the movie. It doesn't have to be about our politics right off the bat. Sure, there can be political aspects to it, but that doesn't mean that we need to interrupt the viewing experience in order to voice our opinions. If we're doing that, then we're no different than the SJW college types that interrupt comedy shows because they went to a comedian that's known for being offensive, and then they got pissed off when, surprise, surprise, they were offensive. It's like the people that shout down at video games because the female protagonist is wearing armor that's not quite heavy enough and not quite covered enough in order to be respectable or realistic. It's a fantasy genre, and it's a fucking video game. Calm down. When the super libertarian type does the same shit, though, they get a pass. One thing that's a driving factor behind these types is that the very people that are most likely to strike down this type of person won't, because they're doing it for their team. It's libertarian tribalism at that point. Because the person's saying all the stuff that we agree with, tons of people that are libertarian aren't going to say anything about the guy voicing libertarian opinions in these types of situations. By doing nothing to shut these people down and let everyone just enjoy the show or enjoy talking about the book or listen to a Rage Against the Machine album without hearing screeching about how they're all leftists now, despite the fact they've been leftists forever, we are enablers if we tolerate that kind of behavior. And even though people who are libertarian, it's a very small circle of people, realistically, when you look at the major political divides, even though people will say they value things like liberty and, they don't want to be taxed to death and they want to have less restrictions on their lives and more economic freedom and sometimes more social freedom and so on and so forth, even though libertarianism is a great fit for most of what society is really pushing to have, it doesn't mean we need to be on that 24/7. I mean, I've got friends that are full-blown socialists. I've got friends that are, one or two friends that are actual communists. I've got some friends that, they spend a little bit too much time on poll. I'm just going to leave it at that. It's okay to have conversations with these people because we don't bother getting into long, heated discussions about our politics. We believe what we believe, but we've got interests outside of that. And as humans, we can connect on those things, talk back and forth, and just have generally interesting discussions without having to jump up and down and start yelling at each other because we are, super libertarians or really into our political beliefs that it has to be everything that we do. I mean, I'm not going to lie. If I'm playing a video game and as a libertarian, part of the video game involves me toppling a monarch, I'm going to enjoy that a little bit. I'm going to get a little bit of a laugh out of that, and I'm going to give myself a little, yeah, a little bit of that in the background. That's okay. It's okay to enjoy seeing things like that in your media or in general conversations. It's like books by Neil Stephenson. He had a book, Cryptology, had another book that I personally love called Snow Crash, and a lot of his stuff is based around crypto-anarchism and around anarcho-capitalism. And it's great to see these relatively unaddressed ideas in a novel that wasn't written by Ayn Rand, that didn't involve 17-page rants, that was really just her philosophical essays put in a giant text box next to a character. Let's be completely honest with what the entirety of Atlas Shrugged was. It's enjoyable to see those things in play in those forms of media, and it's great to enjoy that. But it does not mean that it needs to be your entire bloody life. I can go and talk to people across the political divide because I can talk to them about things that aren't inherently political. If they bring up something that's political, okay, I can test the waters with it, see how it's going, and you know what? If it turns out that it's going to be a big thing, I'll brush it off and I'll move on to something else. I mean, a great example here that I'll use is a little personal example, actually. Some of you out there who are familiar with the quote-unquote SJW movement might be familiar with a particular feminist, and she's known as Big Red. That's the nickname the internet decided to give her because of the color of her hair that she used to have during the time that she used to attend a bunch of protests and would start to, yell and scream at people that were on the opposite side of these protests, and she just became the target of pretty much the internet's physical embodiment of modern third wave feminism. That's the way that she was viewed. I know her in real life. I've gone out and I've had drinks with her before. And you know what? She's got to be one of the most hilarious people that I know. If you get her on the right topic, or you go back and forth with her, especially if her brother's there, it's an absolute hoot to talk to her. When it comes to politics, we keep it light. We don't dive into it too much, because there's a bit of an understanding that we are not in 100% agreement with it. But that doesn't mean that as human beings, we're pieces of shit. So we're not going to jump down each other's throats because there's a disagreement on something as simplistic as, the president of a country that isn't ours because we're both in Canada. Why ruin a good night out for that? Now that's what normal people would do. But the super libertarian type, they're going to jump on that immediately and turn it into a big thing because of what they stand for and what they believe. If Big Red, if the imagined, the boogeyman of modern feminism, if you will, if she could sit down, have a beer, and have a laugh with someone who has opinions that divergent from hers, why can't you? And I say you for whoever is listening to this and thinks, oh well, there's nothing wrong with bringing up my politics every time anyone breathes within 10 feet of me. Yes, there is. That's the whole point. There's 100% problem with that, and you need to stop. The worst of it is the optics, though. I mean, we can put aside the fact that it ruins movies, it ruins political discussion, it puts people outside of the sphere of useful conversation because they need to hold on to their principles so dearly that they can't actually walk away from them enough to get into the discussions they need to be in. I think walk away was kind of the wrong word. You should still hold your principles, but at the same time understand when you need to go into them. I'll use Hayek as an example, F.A. Hayek. F.A. Hayek got called a socialist by a lot of people, got attacked from a whole bunch of libertarians, from classical ones, including more recent attacks from Hoppe and the like. If you go on the think-liberty.com, there was actually an article penned by one Vinnie Marshall, who goes into the defense of Hayek's ideas against the attacks that came against him. But the biggest part that gets missed is the fact that most other libertarian writers at the time, or minarchist writers, classical liberals, anarcho-capitalists at its founding, almost every single one of them were writing hypotheticals. All of the works that these people were putting out at the time that initially criticized Hayek, they were all people that were writing fictional worlds, perfect fictional libertarian worlds that aren't based on the real world, not realistically, but are simply based on how they think these ideas in practice could look in an imaginary land. Hayek was trying to influence heads of state in real time to get liberty-oriented policies enacted. He was attempting to create actual change by dealing with the people making the decisions to make those changes. And that involves being able to make it palatable. That involves being able to present it in a way that is attractive to the people making these decisions, in a way that makes sense, in a way that gives concessions to things that they will not move on. There's a big difference between one person walking to the table at 0, the other person at 100, and you both walking away at 50-50, rather than someone walking up at 0, someone walking up at 100, and you both walk away with the same number. When we try to talk to politicians, or when we try to talk to even the voter base in general, if we're jumping them immediately with heavy-hitting libertarian ideas, then the optics is we're nuts and we don't know what we're talking about because we're starting off at Z. They're maybe at B or C as far as what they understand sometimes. I'll use another great example. A lot of people remember Arvin Vohra, the former vice chair for the LNC. I'll use him as a perfect example of this with his crusade against public schools. Almost every other day, he puts out some form of post criticizing or attacking the very existence of a public school system. And from a pure libertarian perspective, he is correct. It is another apparatus of the state. It's questionably one of the more impactful ones, simply because it also doubles for any types of indoctrination, as we see with the Pledge of Allegiance and other state-oriented things. I mean, even in textbooks, we can see the way that law is explained is it's explained as a necessary thing. It's explained as a mandatory society could not function if government wasn't there to do things for you type of entity. That's indoctrination no matter how you chop it. He's right on that mark. He's also right in the fact that it's still a government expense. It's still forced taxation. It still negatively impacts people who don't have kids, because why are they taking your tax money to fund a school that you're not sending anybody to? All the arguments make sense, but you can't start there. If the idea is to get people to follow libertarianism or to start believing in it, or heaven forbid, showing up and voting for libertarian candidates to try to get the people into office that are going to make the votes and make the decisions to do all of these big repeals that we want to see happen, it's not going to happen if you jump right to abolish public schools. That should be nowhere on anyone's agenda when it comes to libertarianism until we are way down the line where people are used to the idea of replacing or at least complementing what they've considered to be primary services with private ones. When we get closer to that type of world, then we can start mentioning how, hey, you already use private options for everything else. It's proven to be more effective. Let's start repealing this aspect and get it over to that system because we know it's better. The frog in boiling water. That's the approach that we need to take. If we throw them right into the boiling water, they're going to jump out. They're going to run away. You can turn up the temperature and get people more comfortable with these ideas if we're bridging the gap along the way. We can't do that if we try to be super libertarians and jump to the most principled point in the deepest aspect of the conversation before getting anywhere else. It's like you see with a lot of objectivists. A lot of people that take the objectivist route, where they demand, A equals A, morality is based on this because I said it's based on this, so it must be based on this. There's tons of, frankly, circular objects that they try to call logic that they'll use to try to prove that morality is objective. And, okay, I get it. It's a certain area. It's not one I subscribe to. I understand where they're trying to come from here. My personal stance is that objectivism doesn't work without a source. So you need to either believe in the Constitution, God, or something else in order to make it work. But let's go with it. Let them have it. There's people that jump into that. They'll immediately jump into these super heavy principled stances simply because it's the logical conclusion. So they'll jump from A to Z and just hit you with the final mark of what they think is the final mark. But very rarely can you get them to show their work. They're not going to show you what happened between A and Z. They're just going to tell you, no, that's the morally objective, correct answer. Deal with it. No, that's not how you sway people. Sure, you could, at the end of the day, be right. But that doesn't mean the way that you're doing it is right. Taking this approach of throwing high-level concepts at people that aren't necessarily ready for them, especially considering how small of a movement we are, it turns people away. I mean, one of the biggest things that we see, and there's a lot of other libertarians that say that it's not a thing, but, call a spade, it's a thing, is the libertarian to alt-right pipeline. It's a topic that's a little touchy in a lot of libertarian circles just in general, but basic idea is that people get into libertarianism, they get into it a little bit more, they get into it a little bit more, all of a sudden they start to shift out of it, and they go super conservative, super alt-right. And usually, if you talk to the people that have gone down that pipeline, it's the same conversation. They became libertarians because they wanted to be left alone. They realized that having no enforcement mechanism doesn't mean that they're going to be left alone, so they want to have a super powerful state now so they can force people to leave them alone. That's the most common response to the existence of the pipeline that I've heard from people that I've seen go down that pipeline. That only happens if they don't have those back-end principles. That means that they jumped into it, they got hit with things too quickly, like the fact that communist communes would happen in an anarcho-capitalist society. They could buy property, build communes, and have communism. That could be a thing. There's going to be areas that will decide to enter into an agreement that has a form of governance. There's going to be that sort of system. The idea that you can avoid these things if you're asking for absolute freedom means that you didn't understand the concept of absolute freedom when you were walking into it. You didn't realize that it's not absolute freedom just for you, it's for literally everybody, including that guy with the certain skin complexion you don't happen to like, coming from that country you don't happen to like. Too bad. Libertarianism encompasses freedom for everybody. That's the idea. So the existence of that pipeline happens because people walk into it, but they get hit with the boiling water. They don't have time to sit and stew and educate themselves and really learn what libertarianism is about before they hit the water because they deal with the wrong people, and all of a sudden they jump out and they end up going towards the ultra-right in that sense. And it's because of these super libertarian types. I would say that the libertarian to alt-right pipeline would not exist if it weren't for these super libertarian types that immediately jump them with these concepts. It's like, oh, okay, so you're somewhat conservative and you're coming into libertarianism. Okay, let's talk about, what you agree with, what you don't. Let's work through some of the principles. That would be a normal libertarian conversation. The super libertarian is the one that says, oh, you just recently became a libertarian and you used to be a conservative. Okay, so let me go through all of the things that conservatives stand against that you're going to have to put up with now because that's libertarianism. Suck it up, deal with it. Who does that help? That does not help the liberty movement. When you could have changed those people, you could have educated them, you could have gotten them over to the side, but instead you went for, flexing on them. Weird flex, but okay. You decided to virtue signal libertarianism at them to the point where you scared people off, where these people ran away from the liberty movement because they didn't become educated in it. They didn't have that time to adjust. They didn't have that time to learn the deeper aspects of it. And instead were just hit with the super principle, final answer. This is where it all ends up. It's okay to hold those principles. And it's a good thing if you've worked through the concepts of libertarianism to the point where those are the types of pure principles you hold. That's great. But I think the biggest issue, if I had to summarize everything I've talked about so far, the biggest issue is super libertarian types don't understand the idea of an on-off switch. There's times that you can be super principled. If you are writing an article on the principles of libertarianism so that there's a resource out there that explains a certain concept of it and you want to put your knowledge and understanding to use, that's great. Take that approach. Do it that way. Send it to beinglibertarian.com because we do accept guest articles. But don't jump at it with a person who has no idea where you're coming from. If you're having a conversation with a Democrat about taxes in general, don't jump immediately to taxation is theft, you fucking statist. Don't do that. You'd be surprised how fruitful of a conversation you can have with them if you say, okay, you're looking to increase taxes to fit this. Well, isn't there areas where taxes are being wasted? Couldn't we instead clean up that waste and move the money over if you were looking to do that? That's when you can have a conversation where you can walk away with a bit more of a win. If you simply say taxes are theft, okay, fine. Are you right? Yes. But you're also an asshole. So at that point, no one cares if you're right. They're not going to listen to you being right because they don't have time for you if you are that kind of person. To wrap it all up, don't be a super libertarian when you're having conversations with other people. If you know you're talking to another super libertarian type, then by all means, get into the deeper works of one of the 10,000 obscure philosophers that wrote one pamphlet one time back in the 1700s that you both happen to know about, and you're happy to meet someone else that happened to read it out of the 5 people on the planet that did. By all means, enjoy that. Enjoy the understanding that you have and put those principles to use and in practice wherever you can. But if you're going to have a conversation about it, or you're going to try to bring it up, or you're going to try to make a point that it exists, don't jump to Z. Feel free to start with A, or sometimes feel free to leave your politics out of it and just enjoy the conversation going on for the sake of the conversation itself. that's about everything I wanted to cover today. I'm going to wrap up here. As always, you can listen to all of our podcasts on the podcast network, wherever you get your podcasts. You can go to our websites and hit the little subscribe bell in order to get the daily articles on those more principled type articles that you might be fiending for a little bit. And as always, if you liked what you heard and you'd like to hear more, I'll see you next week.